Hello, and welcome to In the Know Women's Show. I am your host, Darleen Adkins, and today we have an educationally dazzling guest. Erin Jones has been in and around education for 30 years, a teacher, instructional coach, district and state administrator. She has received several awards, including Most Innovative Foreign Language Teacher in 2006, Washington Milken Educator of the Year 2008, and a White House Champion of Change Award in 2013. She's a mom of 3 and married. Her husband is a teacher and head coach at Timberline High School. We're fortunate she is a local, having an impact here in our community as well as around the country and abroad. We'll get into those details, so you'll want to grab a pen and a notebook for this episode. We'll cover a lot, unpackage much, and don't be surprised if you get a pop-up quiz. Freshen up your coffee and tea and come back and join us after the opening of our show. Hi, Erin, and thank you so much for making the time to join us today on In the Know Women's Show. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm great, and I'm really excited to be here. This is exciting.
Yay, I'm glad to hear that. We've had a lot of fun, our first 5 episodes, and been a little bit on a hiatus here at the end of summer, but we're back now, and you are wonderful, and thank you so much. I've been learning so much about you, going out there and doing my internet research. So we can start anywhere. I don't know if you start in the beginning a lot and kind of move through it sequentially to today, or if you'd like to start with kind of what's been happening recently, and then we'll kind of go back and reflect on things. What's your preference?
You know, maybe I'll talk about just what I've done in the last couple of weeks, because it's been a lot. We're back to school, so it's the end of summer. And I've been an educator for, I think this is year 32 that I've been working in and around schools, but 30 years on staff somewhere. And back to school as a consultant is my busiest time of year. So I've been opening school districts and doing administrator training and classified staff training and certificated educator training, and I love this season of the year. It's really crazy busy, and I love inspiring educators to think about their why as they're going back into buildings. I think we need to be reminded, especially because the last year was, I think, the hardest year in education in any recent decades. I think this last year was even harder than the first year of the pandemic. And so to be able to go in and really inspire the educators who are going to have to be in front of young people to think about, why am I here? And how do I stay fired up about this work even when it's hard?
Is that K through 12? Or do you have a particular grade level you're working with?
It's everybody. So yesterday I keynoted at an early learning conference. The day before that I was at Oregon State University Higher Ed. The day before that I was with office professionals for Puyallup School District. The week before that I was with administrators in a K-12 system. So it is literally the span of education from early learning to higher ed.
Wow.
Yeah.
And can you tell us a little bit about what does that look like when you're training these educators? What does that include?
So I wouldn't say, I'm not an expert on this, but a lot of the work that I do is around racial reconciliation, thinking about how do we, especially in this moment, have more effective conversations about race and equity. However, sometimes when I get called into districts in the last few weeks, it's been a lot about just pure inspiration, because people are really feeling weighed down and a little discouraged and anxious, and you know, with all of the violence that happened in schools last year, people are on edge. And so part of my job has been to just inspire people and get them reconnected again, and kind of humanize the profession. And so typically a year or 2 years ago, I would have been doing racial equity work 100%. But now it really depends on the district and what they need. And some have just said, we just need somebody to come and inspire our people, because they're coming in heavy, they're coming in worried. We've lost a lot of educators who've left their profession, and so how do we encourage people when things are really hard? So I've done a lot of that this year, and I love that. I love helping people to find hope in places where hope doesn't present itself easily.
Right, yeah. And I think you mentioned that there's an award that's going to be given. Is that a spoiler alert? We don't have to cover that one.
We can. Had we done this recording 2 weeks ago, it was a secret, but I learned about 4 or 5 months ago that I was receiving an award from the Green River Foundation. So Green River Community College has a foundation, and the Hanford family has donated a lot of money. Mr. Hanford just passed away last year or the year before, and he left an endowment. And as part of the endowment, he asked that the university pick an education leader each year to honor as their education leader of the year, and that person gets to give away a scholarship to an incoming student.
Wow.
What is so exciting about that is I get to be the inaugural recipient of this education award. And it is, I'm still kind of blown away because I'm not going to say who else was on the list to be selected, but they were all big dogs. And then they chose me. And in fact, I think the selection team all read my book. I wrote a book that was published exactly a year and 2 weeks ago. And they all read my book and made a decision based on the book that they wanted to honor me with the award. And the really amazing piece of that story is the student who's being chosen did not know that I was the one giving the grant, the scholarship away, and she wrote about me in her scholarship essay.
Is that right?
And she had no idea
that
I was the person, and she just said, Erin Jones is part of the reason that I'm going to college. I met her years ago. Just to have something like that happen, and then I get to give her the scholarship. So she just learned earlier this week, and published it on her Facebook, and that's how I knew. I think it's okay to talk about it now.
I see. Well, that's wonderful. That's incredible. And can you talk a little bit about your book?
Sure. So I have been talking about race pretty explicitly for 15 years now. I was raised in a home, even though I am an adoptee, so I'm a transracially adopted kid. I'm not a kid anymore, but I will always be my parents' kid. But my parents are both white. And even though I think I always knew that I was not the same color as them, they grew up in a time, I'm 51, they're in their late 70s, where in the United States, we just didn't talk about race. And that created a lot of harm in our family, between relatives and other people in the community. But I ended up being raised in the Netherlands, where there just weren't a lot of conversations about race because the dynamics of race and ethnicity and nationality are really different there. When I came back to the United States for college in 1989, I suddenly became aware that race is a thing in America, and being a black female was not the same as being a white female. And people reminded me of that almost daily in college. But what became painfully obvious in the last 2 or 3 years is that we still don't know how to talk about race, and so we're causing harm to one another. And I watched as people I knew really well, that I'd known for 25 years of being here in Washington State, I watched after Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and then George Floyd were murdered, I watched people that I knew and loved say really horrible things about skin color and paint the entire black community in a really negative way, but then say things to me like, oh, but you're not like them. We like you. And it was so painful to watch people say things on social media, to watch people engage with family in ways that were really dehumanizing, that I said, okay, how can I be part of the solution? Well, I can write about my story, my own journey through abandonment by my biological mother for being biracial, adoption by my white parents, discomfort in America, moving to Europe, coming back to America, having to navigate my own identity. I can write about that as a way to help people think about their own journey. And so the book is called Bridges to Heal Us, Stories and Strategies for Racial Healing. It's not my autobiography, but it is autobiographical. So I use stories because one of the things I learned, even as a classroom teacher, is stories connect the head and the heart. I've always been a storyteller. My parents, we read all the time. As a little girl, my parents read out loud to us. We read books all the time. And so I think story has always been part of me. Telling stories became part of me when I became a classroom teacher for middle school students, because I realized they needed to be engaged and entertained while they were learning. And so I became a really good storyteller as a middle school teacher. And if you can engage a 12-year-old, you can engage anyone. And so I've been telling stories, and I thought, how do I take some of the stories about true things that I've experienced in life around race and help people think about their own story, and then give people some strategies to think about how can they find and develop and create healing in their own community.
Wow, really incredible. You know, I reflect back on my childhood and growing up, and I had parents that were from Kentucky and Tennessee that met in Ohio and established their family there in the 70s. And I went to a school that was fairly well integrated, and my mother was just so welcoming. It was incredible that she could have that kind of heart and that kind of openness for others. And I asked her about that, and she said, well, that's how we did down in the South. You just pick people up on the road if they needed a ride, if you were lucky enough to have a car, and help others. And she said, I brought that to Ohio. That's how I looked out at the world. Now, I also understand there's a lot of folks saying, I'm not a racist, but I'm not a racist. Could we get into a little bit of that and unpackage that? I'm not saying that anymore, because I think, while I think there may be things I'm just not aware of because I don't understand how to unpackage it and where am I maybe playing a part. Now, I've been learning because I knew that there may be this blind spot of mine, like there is about other things too, where suddenly we're clued in, we're like, oh, I got it. But maybe you can help our viewers walk through that if they're struggling with it too. You know, how do you become aware? How do you understand the intricacies of racism and some of these other words that they're utilizing that maybe go right over the heads of people, like institutional racism, and things of that nature. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, so although if I were to go deep into all the terms, it would take us an hour and a half. So I'll try to give the brief description. But one of the things I avoid doing is calling people racists.
Okay.
Because I think it's just, I'm really big on creating brave spaces where we don't shame, blame, and guilt people.
Okay.
And I think we do a lot of shaming, blaming, and guilting of people. We call them racist, sexist, misogynist, homophobic. We do a lot of that, istenic. And I think, having been a middle school teacher for so long, when people feel ashamed, they don't learn. They may change their behavior for a hot second, but who wants to learn in an environment where they're being called names? So I really avoid calling people names.
Okay.
I think systems can be racist. And here's where I think terminology is really important. All people can be prejudiced. All people can have bias. And what that means is you can decide, either for good or ill, to paint an entire group of people, whether by skin color, by language, by height, by weight. You can paint
gray hair.
There
maybe.
we go, gray hair, age, right? Perceived age. We can paint whole swaths of people, and all of us are capable of, regardless of our race, regardless of our gender, we are all capable of prejudging people. Okay? Racism, though, is really thinking about who has power. Black and brown people don't have power in space to change law. And so black and brown people can't impact white people in the same way that white people as a system can impact black and brown people. So I talk about racism in terms of systems. So where have systems been created over time that impact people based on their skin color? So let's take Washington State for an example. Olympia for a while was a whites-only city. Black people were not allowed to live within the city limits. There are still neighborhoods in Olympia that were redlined, meaning that Black people could not get loans to buy homes in those communities. And in fact, last year at Juneteenth, when we did our Juneteenth event, there was a white gentleman who showed up. He said, I'm 82, I think he said, and he'd been going through his garage, cleaning things out after his wife died, and found a document that was the deed to his house. And it said in the deed, may not be sold to a Negro.
Wow.
Right here in Olympia. And so that's an example of racism.
Okay.
A system, a policy, a practice that's been set into place that creates harm, creates roadblocks for a particular group of people. I don't like talking about how people interact with each other, individual to individual, using the term racism. I just don't think it's useful. I think it shuts people down. Can we hate people based on skin color? Everyone is capable of that. And so I talk a lot about love. How do we love people who are different? How do we get curious about people who are different from us? I think that's really critical. I think it's easy to hate a group of people if you have no relationship with anyone who looks like that, sounds like that, behaves like that.
Right.
And so one of my strategies for people is think about who's in your circle. So if you're on social media, look at your social media following. Does everyone look like you, sound like you, believe the same thing, vote the same way? You probably need to expand your circle. I am really intentional. I was raised as a Christian. My husband was a Christian pastor for a long time. My best friend here in Olympia is Muslim and from Bangladesh. Like, we could not be more different in a lot of ways, and yet I love her like a sister. I have friends in my circle who are trans, friends who identify as queer, friends who are non-binary, friends who don't speak English fluently. I am really intentional. I have friends who really love their guns. I don't love guns. I don't understand gun lovers. And I still have friends who have lots of different perspectives. And I think that helps me be a better American. I think it helps me be a better human. And so a lot of the work I talk about is, yeah, there are all these terms out there, but in the end, how do we show up and see people's humanity? And then are we willing to look in our community at who's thriving and who's not? Because really, if we're going to think about ending racism, and I would also say there's being not racist and then there's being anti-racist.
Yeah.
I don't want people to just not be racist. I actually want them to actively work to unpack systems and to take down barriers to make sure that everyone is able to thrive. It doesn't help me if you're just not going to hate me.
I get that. I think I get that, as best as I can. But one of the examples after my awakening, as I call it, years ago about some other matters was, now when I'm in a room, if I see that we're all women in the room and there's a gentleman that walks in and wants to join because of our meeting or such, I know immediately that I'd like to be inclusive. Like, I get that now.
Yeah.
And I think it's because I had moments of insight. And I mean, there was a time where I called myself sort of clueless, and I don't use that, in a real bad way. I don't mean it that way, but I just was somewhat ignorant. I hadn't experienced the world yet. And then I went off and started traveling and living other places. And then I did get a clue, and it was around certain people that I think kind of understood community, and that differences were okay. And, I was like, I heard the voices singing, the angels singing, and I said, I see, I get it. And also it helped being in a community where I was actually a minority. I lived in the northern part of Alaska for about 10 years. And, I became a member of that community, and I had to show up well, not as an outsider just coming in for a bit, and working and taking off, but I got accepted into the community and then supporting the community in different activities and organizations, and I grew as a person. So if we can now, let's go back and sort of like talk about your upbringing and maybe talk about these pivotal moments for maybe humans in general, but also specifically for you, where you were becoming enlightened and getting it, and maybe some of those mentors along the way right on up to now, even if you still have mentors. And still
Always.
having the aha moments, even as we're around 50, now.
Yeah.
So let's go back and talk about the childhood in the Netherlands and move through those years, if you don't mind.
Yeah, and I think I'll start with how we got to the Netherlands, because I was born in St. Paul, Minnesota, which has a lot of context now because, of course, it's right next to Minneapolis, Minnesota. So if we think about so many things that have happened in eruptions in Minnesota now, today, it speaks to what was possible back in 1971 when I was born in a hospital and left there and then sent to the Children's Home Society. My mother was a white woman. My father was a Negro man, and that's what was on my birth certificate. I was sent to the Children's Home Society and adopted by a white couple from northern Minnesota who had zero relationship with the Black community. They just wanted to adopt children that nobody wanted. That's how I got chosen.
Wow.
And as I frame my story, I tell people I don't see myself as rejected by a mother. I see myself as chosen by the Adamson family. And they just loved me, period. And always have. And in fact, today, they are my biggest fans. And I see them as my heroes. They're the most unassuming couple ever. If they were in a busy room, you would not know they were there. They like to hide in the back. But they're incredibly courageous. And they decided, out of all their family, who all stayed in small town northern Minnesota, they wanted to see the world and they wanted to take their children. And so we moved to the Netherlands when I was 5 years old. My dad took a job sight unseen at the American School of The Hague, which is the school that served all the United Nations lawyers for the World Court, all of the ambassadors, employees for the American Embassy, Microsoft Europe, all of the oil company executives' children. So here I was, this once rejected Black girl, teacher's kid, not wealthy, suddenly sitting next to people whose parents made lots and lots of money, who had drivers bring them to school, who lived in mansions. Meanwhile, we lived in a little tiny apartment and didn't have a car for most of my elementary school life. But what I learned, speaking of pivotal moments, I learned really early that having money and titles wasn't what made people great. It was how they chose to use that money and title. And I realized, even as a little girl, wow, maybe if I show up and work hard, maybe if I'm kind to people, I can be great too. And I was aware of that as a really little kid, but I would have a really pivotal experience as a 4th grade kid. My best friend was Yael. Her dad was the Israeli ambassador. So of course in 1980, that mattered because Israel and Palestine were in conflict, as they have been for a long time. But imagine before the internet, before cell phones. So Israel is in conflict with Palestine, bombs are going off, and she still has family back in Israel. And she's my seatmate in my classroom, and my heart breaks for her. And I decide as a 9-year-old kid, what can I do to help her? Well, I can learn her language. And so I began to learn Hebrew as a 9-year-old kid. And then my parents dragged me to some PTA meeting, and I was not excited about that. But I brought my book, and I was going to sit at the back and just read. And it turns out, not only was the Israeli ambassador's kid at my school, but the Palestinian ambassador's kid was also at my school. And these 2 dads were at the PTA meeting talking about the education of their children. And I knew as a 4th grade kid, if they can talk about education, I bet I could get them to talk about peace. And I made that decision as a 9-year-old kid.
Wow.
And I would go back to my classroom and begin to learn Arabic too. Because I knew if we're going to broker peace, we probably should speak both languages. And I already had that instinct as a little girl to build bridges. And so I began to learn Arabic and Hebrew. And then we got a visit from Anwar Sadat's wife, the Egyptian president at the time. His country was in the middle of a civil war in 1981. And his wife, Mrs. Sadat, had this vision: if we could just do assemblies with small children and get really little children to think about peace, maybe we could stop all the war that's happening around the world. She had a friend named John Denver, and he was going to travel with her and sing with the choir at the school. And then she would speak, and then they would pick 3 little kids to have lunch with them afterwards. So I sang with John Denver as a 9-year-old kid. Had no idea what that meant at 9 years old. But we sang with him. I got to hear her speak, and I was one of the 3 children selected to have lunch with them afterwards.
Is that right? Wow.
And Mrs. Sadat would ask all 3 of us, how do you want to change the world? And I said right away, I'm going to bring peace to the Middle East. I'm learning to speak Arabic and Hebrew. And someday I'll broker peace. And she looked at me and she pointed at me and said, you, Erin, are a world changer. And I think about that now as an educator. The words we use to children matter. And we can either inspire them to life that's bigger than anything, or we can destroy them with our words. And that day, she inspired me to be a world changer. And I would never look back from that. I knew that I have to live my life as a world changer. I have to do the best wherever I am. I have to seek opportunities to build bridges with people. And I think I just never stopped doing that. I just got bigger and have continued to build bridges ever since.
Yeah. And you received an award as a change maker. That award came in 2013.
Yes.
Can you talk a little?
From President Obama, actually. So it was a surprise. In fact, all the awards that I've gotten are surprises. They were things I didn't know were coming. But I got a call. I had worked at the state superintendent's office for 4 years on cabinet. And then I was working as the director of equity for the Federal Way School District. And one day, it was a Thursday, I got a call and they said, this is so-and-so from the White House. I'm like, what White House? The White House? Why? And this voice said, you were nominated for an award, and can you be in DC Tuesday?
Wow.
And I got to fly to DC and receive an award. At the time, Arnie Duncan was the Secretary of Education, and I got to receive an award from Arnie Duncan for the work that I had done to support African American children in the state of Washington. 10 of us got that award. And it was just such an incredible experience to be there. I got to bring my boys with me, and they were just blown away. It was so amazing. My mom and dad got to go. And then the second day we were there, we had been told, bring a formal outfit because there's a surprise. President Obama was hosting the Black History Month event at his home, the White House. And I got to pick one guest. I picked my mom, of course, had to pick my mom. And my mom and I got to go to the White House.
Is that right?
And we got to see Al Sharpton. I got to meet Stevie Wonder,
Oh my goodness.
Harry Belafonte, Felicia Rashad, Tatiana Ali,
Oh my goodness.
Vivica Fox. It was unreal. It was unreal. Oh, Magic Johnson, who as a basketball player, to be able to hang out with Magic Johnson was pretty incredible. But we got to go to that, and just to be reminded again, it's not about title. It's how do you choose to use the gifts and talents you've been given? How do you choose to use the opportunities, whether you just have a couple seeds in your hand or you have lots of seeds? How are you using those? And so I tell people all the time, man, I may have received some awards, but there are lots of really amazing people out in the world doing great things. How are we lifting those people up? And then you may feel like a nobody, but use whatever talents you have. And whether the whole world gets to see it or just your neighborhood or just your house, doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
Use the talents and gifts you've been given and life experiences you've been given and choose to make our world a better place.
Yeah, wow, incredible words. And I feel so thankful that I understand that, because I know there are possibly people go all their lives and never really understand the depth of that. And I got that, as I mentioned, perspective when I lived in northern Alaska and I had to return home to care for aging parents. And while I was a little sad to return because my life had been so big and grand up there, I had really blossomed and got to travel and experience this new culture, and it was like a day it was a National Geographic program every day, right there at the end of of the United States, the northernmost city. But I came home and I decided, let me go back with these gifts, pay it forward, if you will. And I am going home for a serious reason to care for aging parents, but I may be able to build community and also in creative and fun ways that help others. Keeps me okay with the task at hand, and be there for my parents now. Be there for them, but also get some needs met through these creative adventures in our community. And it worked out. And I wonder sometimes if we don't have all this conflict in the world, I'll just speak kind of locally, because we're not aware, we haven't been shown how community building is a wonderful thing and you can bridge differences. As soon as I got that, a whole new world opened for me. I came from, that little street or kind of inner city street in Cincinnati that was rough. It was challenging when I walked outside my door, even with my besties. I didn't know if I might get into a fight, It was intimidating, it was scary. I lived that day in, day out to finally grow up and go through some difficulty and be in this other world with these other people and then learn the beauty of looking at challenges in a different way and enjoying community and the care of others and also giving that. That was an incredible, almost probably 360 change in my mindset and my heart and everything else. So I'm glad there are people, like yourself who are very influential, who can make a great impact on not community, yes, important, but statewide and countrywide and abroad too. And that might be a good segue. How are you doing?
I'm good.
You're still going well? You're okay. I know I keep firing these questions, and if we need to take
Remember, I taught middle school, so we're good.
You're
good.
Yeah.
Have a lot of stamina.
All right. Okay. So I mentioned abroad. You're affecting things abroad as well, and I believe when I texted you, you were traveling.
Yeah.
You'd been on place. I don't know if you had been out of the country at that time.
I was out. I was in Mexico for 2 weeks.
Okay.
Yeah,
Was that R&R?
It was this
Okay.
year. So we try to get to Mexico every summer. So I got to play basketball in La Ciudad de Mexico when I was 30 years old. And ever since then, I try to get back as much as I can. So we try to go, once our kids were in college, we try to go every summer. And this year typically we go for a week, but this year I said to my husband, this year's been so crazy, can we go for 2 weeks? And so we went for 2 weeks, and we try to stay not in big cities. So we were in a place called Puerto Morales, which is about 45 minutes outside of Cancun. And I try to only speak Spanish, and we met all kinds of amazing people from all over the world, and just we did no excursions at all. We just ate and read a lot of books and slept a lot, and I did a lot of running, and it was just happy. Yeah.
Nice. And who are you reading these days? Do you have some favorite authors?
So I just read Octavia Butler's series. It's a mini-series. It's Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents. It's a two dystopian novels. She wrote in the 90s, about 2032. Can I tell you what's so terrifying is she could have been talking about right now. She talks in her book about a president that uses the slogan, "Make America Great Again."
Wow.
In her book. And really fascinating. So I just read those. Right now I'm working on writing my second book, so I'm doing a lot more writing than I am reading right now, but I loved reading Octavia Butler. I love reading short stories. I read a lot of nonfiction just about race and reconciliation and teaching, so I do a lot of reading about teachers, but right now I'm working on writing.
Yeah.
So Just wait, it's coming. I've got another book I hope will be out by this time next year.
Is that right? Okay. Well, you might have to come back and tell us more about that. What about mentors? Are we too old for mentors?
Never.
50-something?
Never. And my rule is I always want to have someone who's more veteran than me, and I always want to be pouring into someone younger than me. At least one person. I usually have more than one person younger than me. So I would say I have a couple high school students that are going into college right now that I mentor. I have a young adult woman that I mentor. And then above me, I have several women that and several men actually, that I really look to depending on what I'm doing to really seek out for advice and listen to them, and I follow them on social media. And so I think I'm trying to always learn from people who've gone before me. If I can avoid making mistakes, I try. But I don't think we're ever too old to have mentors. And sometimes those mentors are alive. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're people that have gone before us that we're just reading their books and we're watching old videos of them. And so Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has always been one of my favorites to read about and to listen to some of his old speeches and to be reminded that there's still so much work to be done. And I am really passionate about nonviolence, so I really appreciated his perspective on the work. And so I do a lot of reading of his work and other people's perspectives on his work, and then just listening to his voice. And he's a great orator, and so I'm always inspired by him. Yeah.
Wonderful. Wow. Okay, we could be at the time where we need a pop-up quiz.
Pop-up quiz. Okay.
Yes, I instructed the audience to go get that pen and notebook and refresh the tea and coffee at the beginning of the show.
Okay.
What would be a helpful pop-up quiz for folks? Let's go with 1 through 5, home audience, and maybe some thoughtful and mindful questions for us to be thinking about and writing to get our thoughts down and to review them in print.
So I think about 3 words. Everywhere I go, there are 3 words or ideas that I talk about. And so I have 3 questions that I would ask people. And I actually write about this in my book, Bridges to Heal Us. It's one of the first chapters. I talk about the power of gratitude. Gratitude, literally, when we make it a habit, it will change our brain chemistry. Literally, it changes the dendrites. They will reform in our brain if we practice gratitude on a regular basis and it becomes habit. Our brains will literally become more positive. And I would encourage people to think about what in your worlds right now can you be grateful for? And there are some days where you're going to have great big gratitude, and other days where it's going to be a little gratitude. You're having kind of a tough day. The beauty of the science of gratitude is that it actually doesn't matter how big or small your gratitude is. It's the practice of being grateful. So my first question to people today that you can write, or you can turn and say this to your child or your partner who's sitting next to you, what are you grateful for today? And then think about how could you make that a regular practice. So maybe if you're at home by yourself, grab a journal and just start being intentional about every day jotting down something that you're grateful for. If you're on social media, you could use your Instagram page to just share an image that you're grateful for each day and encourage others to also take on, because when we can all come from a positive place, it changes how we show up in the world. So question number 1, what are you grateful for today? Second word I talk a lot about is being brave. And so when I think about being brave, I think about being vulnerable. I think about embracing discomfort. I spend a lot of my time in white, rural America. It's not easy to be in spaces that I'm the only one who looks like me, talking about race. And I can't expect people to build bridges if I'm not willing to go out first and start with the discomfort. One of the reasons I run now is because it's my physical practice of pushing through discomfort. I hated running. If I didn't have a ball, I didn't understand why people ran. But I run now probably about 12 miles a week because I have to physically practice pushing through discomfort. That's one of my practices with being brave. Another practice of being brave is not shaming, blaming, and guilting people or myself. Choosing when I make a mistake to apologize and then let it go and choose to grow. And then another piece of being brave is getting curious about people who are really different from me for whatever reason. So my second question around being brave is, what would it mean for you to be your best and bravest self today? What would that take? What would that look like and sound like? Because for some of us, it's going to look one way. If you're an introvert, it's going to look very different than it will look for an extrovert, being brave. Being brave may be just showing up at an event, maybe turning on your camera in that Zoom call. Brave for someone else is actually being quiet because you take up too much space, right? So I would ask, first question, what are you grateful for? Second question, what does brave look like for you today? Third question, it's love is really my third word, love. And love is not the mushy kind of love, like going around and hugging and kissing everyone. It's choosing to see the humanity in the people around you and to treat them as if they are equally valuable in the world. But it's also, how do you love yourself? Those people who are giving all the time, so people who are doing justice work, people who are educating, serving, tend to give away and end up giving out of empty. How can we truly love other people if we don't first love ourselves? And so what I would ask people as the third question is, how are you loving yourself right now? And how are you loving people around you who are not easy to love? It's really easy to love the people who are just like you, people who don't cause you any grief, they don't frustrate you ever, they stay quiet. How are you loving yourself and how are you loving the difficult people around you? That would be my third question. And I really believe if we could do those three things, we could change the world.
Yeah. Those could be very challenging for people. I'm thankful. I think those are easier for me now, but I have a little bit of homework, I think, though. I need to examine that a little bit deeper, perhaps. We're running a little bit toward the end of our show, but one thing you brought up about the brain, the topic of the brain, and I feel like perhaps that's been the missing approach to some of our societal issues. I'm getting to be a real fan of learning about the brain and how it connects to things. We have the technology today that we've never had before in regard to observing the brain and what it does. And are you a believer in this new program that's out there? If you've heard of it, it's called Neural Education, and it's for teachers. And I just discovered it because I was looking into some curriculum suggestions that are happening out there for kids to learn about their brain. So you don't wait till you're 70 anymore when you're worried about your brain, or if you just happen to learn it somewhere along the way in college or some in your biology class. No, children would actually learn about their brain, and I'm kind of a fan of it because I think maybe kids could learn what that amygdala is doing when they're fearful. And maybe, when we're fearful, these other things are cropping up that make us dislike situations and others and so forth. Is that something you would entertain as a possible approach to helping children maybe deal with conflict or others or such? I don't know if you've heard much about that yet or not, or if that's something you would think about incorporating.
I haven't heard of that particular program, but I talk a lot about mindfulness with children. So we do ground-in activities. So anytime I work with students, we will practice gratitude, we practice being courageous, and then we do mindfulness activities. So I train them in how to, when you feel your body getting anxious, we talk about the emotions that we feel. which didn't happen when we were children. We didn't talk about emotions at all. So we help students name their emotions. And then when you feel anxious, when you feel upset, breathing activities to just get them calm. So I think there's incredible power in mindfulness activities and getting students to check in with themselves and take time to really think about, how am I showing up in the space? I think also we have to use brain science. I mean, I think there's so much knowledge about how the brain works. So I don't know about the particular program you're talking about, but I do think teachers need to be trained in brain science. And there are lots and lots of schools now that are helping educators understand how the brain works. And so thinking about what are we teaching at what levels. I think growth mindset versus fixed mindset is something that I have spent most of my career talking with students and staff about. So it's funny because I taught a class right before we were here, and one of my students said, well, I can't draw that. And I said, yet. And they said, what? I said, you can't draw that yet. And they just looked at me and I said, I'm gonna hold you to that, Alex. Yet, someday. And so I think really helping people realize you can change, you can grow, and you can change and grow into your 50s and 60s and 70s. And I think even for me, about the last couple of months, I went through menopause last year, and my body absolutely changed. And I went from being shaped in a particular way. I'm still fit. I was still working out and everything, but my body composition changed. And I think there was a part of me that thought, well, I'm 50 now, and maybe this is just the end. And then I started lifting weights and going to training. And it's really incredible to realize, okay, even at 51, I can still change my body. But I think we have this mentality that, once you hit a certain place, this is just all there is. And so I have to model that practice of, we can change things. We can get better. We can change how we show up to certain groups of people, just like we can change our body structure, just like we can change our mentality about certain things that are hard for us, whether that's cooking or drawing or learning how to do something new that you've not done before. We can all learn and grow. So I think brain science is really critical. I think it's also really important teaching students to unpack how they learn. Not everyone is the same kind of learner. And so helping students understand how they learn. Are you a kinesthetic learner? Do you prefer oration? Do you prefer to just listen to someone? Do you have to read? And really helping our students understand their own brains, I think, is really critical. And I think we miss the boat when we don't provide students at a young age with learning about how their bodies work.
Yeah, and it seems like it's something that could be easily incorporated. They learn about their bodies anyway. So, well, Erin, thank you. I don't think I can say that enough for making time for us here at In the Know Women Show, coming on as a guest and sharing your life with us. We so appreciate that, and I know our community does too.
It's my honor. This is service, right? I mean, everybody has something to offer. So last thing I would say to people is, if you're out there and you think you don't have anything to offer, I would argue, I don't even need to know you. I've never met anyone who has nothing to offer.
Yeah.
And so I just feel like it's such an honor to be here, sitting in this chair. This is service to me. It's such an incredible honor to serve my community.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you again.
I'm Darleen Adkins, and I've been your host for the 6th episode of In the Know Women Show. Thank you for joining us.